You guys remember Resident Evil 4? I hope you do. It's going to be very, very relevant for this review. Understand this concept. The idea of a spiritual successor is taking something that people generally love, or at least they like a lot and hold up in high regard, and then do something that isn't a sequel or a prequel or in the same continuity, but to do something that addresses a lot of the same key points of it. An example of this is how Yooka-Laylee is a spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie. Not necessarily a good one, but one that hits a lot of the same notes, in that it's a large level-based collectathon with major focus on platform, in addition to a lot of other aesthetic elements such as cutesy characters and gobbledygook dialogue. So in comes Evil Within, in which Shinji Mikami wants to make the magic of Resident Evil 4 again, and he wants it to be the return of true survival horror. And it didn't quite work out that way.
That old guy's gonna get himself killed.
Now, if you were to look at the elements of the game and the elements of Resident Evil 4 in comparison, you might wonder where a lot of the flaws come in. And to be honest, a lot of it has to do with difficulty and world building / narrative. Now, I'm not one to knock a game for being difficult. I've beaten literally every single game in the Souls series, from Demon Souls up until Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne, and I'm currently doing a run of Cuphead. I genuinely do not mind if a game is hard, but it's a matter of whether or not you feel the difficulty is fair or if you feel as if it's justified. When I'm playing Evil Within, I don't feel as if I'm having a hearty challenge most of the time. I genuinely feel as if I'm put in a situation where you have survival horror mechanics, such as the very low ammo and the constricted movement and the relatively slow-moving enemies. However, what this game has as an addendum to that, which still hasn't been addressed to this day with the exception of adding an easy mode, is the fact that almost every enemy, unless you are very careful, tends to be a damage sponge. They will take many, many hits to put down, and they take forever to kill if you don't have exactly the right kind of weapon and exactly the right kind of ammo, which, based on the tropes of survival horror, are very scarce. And that's not to say that there aren't enemies in Resident Evil 4 and other survival horror games that don't have this trait as well. However, this game doesn't necessarily limit it only to its bosses. This game also applies it to a lot of the common enemies, and it's often hard to tell when you are or aren't doing damage unless you do very specific things like shooting their legs off or something. I bring this up because many of the bosses you can't actually tell how much damage you're doing, if any. One example is the Chainsaw Sadist from relatively early in the game. No matter what you do to him, he will not flinch when you shoot him. And there are many times in which I would do high amounts of damage from him, whether it be shooting him with a shotgun or throwing a grenade or having these spikes in the floor go up to kill him, which is an insta-kill for the other enemy, and I assume that was the method in which you would have him be killed, by having this plethora of spikes shoot down at him from the ceiling. But he just shrugs them off and he runs over to you and he kills you. This left me thinking that this was a puzzle boss and that I had to lead him somewhere, maybe push him off a high ledge or set him on fire. But after much trial and error, I eventually discovered he just has a lot of health. That's it. There was nothing profound. I didn't have to think. I hadn't taken the initiative to do anything intelligent with my attack patterns. I just had to keep hitting him and then running away, and then finding ammo and hitting him and running away. And this, in theory, can be a very tense moment. It could be something that's very claustrophobic, very tension building. But the issue that we come into is that my feelings during this time were not that of tension and relief as much as annoyance. And then when it was done, I felt annoyed at that solution being the one that was there. That's not to say that all the bosses are unsatisfying, but a few of them have these kind of rules and mechanics where the rules are different. This isn't to say that all the bosses are bad, but it does lend itself to the idea that you don't have a very clear indication of whether or not you are or are not doing the correct thing during a boss, and it leads to dying over and over and over again. I'm no stranger to doing this when I would die constantly in previous survival horror games. The difference is, when I died there, I felt it was either due to poor preparation or a mishandling of skills, as opposed to a complete lack of an idea on how to progress or what I was supposed to do. And this mentality of I'm not sure what's going on is not inherently something that's exclusive to gameplay. It also carries into the plot. I'm gonna put forth a hypothesis for you. My hypothesis in regards to the way that they designed this game is that they started off with the very baseboards being, we are gonna have the foundation of this game be Resident Evil 4 spiritual successor. So we're gonna start by building levels and building enemies and weapons and boss encounters, and it's gonna be great. But then, sometime down the line, they realized that they had all these really cool ideals for levels and enemies and weapons, but eventually they came across a snag and realized, shit, we just made a bunch of levels that have nothing to do with each other, and a bunch of enemies that have nothing to do with each other, and we probably don't even have an idea for a main character yet. What do we do? And then it dawned on Shinji and his team. I've got it, he said. We'll make the game set inside a crazy man's mind, so that anything can happen. He doesn't have to make sense, you see. He's crazy, like a crazy man who's crazy, you know. And that's the crux of my argument in regards to why the level design on an individual level basis is relatively good, but as a whole is, ironically enough, very schizophrenic. And no, that isn't some intentional metaphor, like in some other games where they try and do it to disorient you. This game, from what I can tell, seems to try and present itself as having a relatively straightforward narrative, but then, when it comes to you actually playing it, you go to a million different places with seemingly no clear reason as to how or why you're going anywhere. If I'm gonna compare this to, say, other games in the genre, usually you have a very clear set idea of what you're doing next. When you're playing Resident Evil 7, you're looking to find your wife. When you're playing Resident Evil 4, you're trying to find the president's daughter. When you're playing Dead Space, you're trying to, either, depending on the game, fix the ship or find a way off the ship. And now, this isn't to say that you don't have a very clear goal in Evil Within, which, as far as you can tell, halfway through the game, is to get to Beacon Hospital, but up until that point, it's basically, I'm going to move forward and not die. And that's not a bad motivation, but from a narrative standpoint, it's very weak. It's very much, what's going on? I better run away. It's not compelling in comparison. Because in a situation like this, you think it would be equally reasonable for the cop to try and radio for backup and stay put where he is so that they can keep his location on track. Among other things, you'd think if he is trying to look for his partner, then they would bunker down in one area until they can get some backup. But they don't, and this would be fine if they had a clear motive in mind, but they never seem to know where they're going, why, how, or anything. It seems to be very much the level guiding you in one direction, especially with the way that the camera points towards the way out, as opposed to you actually having any sort of motives or goals all the time. So to give a few examples of this really scattergun approach to level design, the very first level takes place in an abandoned hospital, which is what a lot of the promotional material was showing, and I was initially like, okay, cool. It can be sort of like a Silent Hill Outlast kind of thing, I can dig it. Then it switches to being in the forest, which I could buy, because it's like, hey, maybe you're outside the hospital, or maybe you're just somewhere in near proximity to the place where you need to be. Fair enough. Then you're in a farming village. I'm kind of lost. Okay, how? And then you're in a castle town. Okay, hang on. Why is there a castle next to? And then you're in an abandoned building. Okay, that one's not as unreasonable, but it still leaves a lot. And then you're in the sewers. Why do you need to go down into the sewer? And then you're in some caves. And then you're in some other place with a bunch of pipes and blood and shit. And then you're in an insane asylum, and then you're in a goopy place, and all of it seems very much like they had no idea what they had for a plot, and they decided, oh, it's a dreamscape. It can be random if we want it to be. This in and of itself would be fine if the plot lended itself to this premise. However, it doesn't necessarily do this in an elegant way. In fact, it does so in a way that seems to be highly contradictory to every other point in the story. To summarize very shortly, and I should mention there's going to be spoilers from this point forward. The villain, Ruvik, is a brain, previously part of a human, but now it's just the brain of that human sitting in the middle of this machine that can take consciousness of many people and put them together collective. But since he's at the center of the operation, and since the machine which does this, STEM, can only do this through his brain as a sort of central hub, it means that he basically has godlike control over the whole system, being able to teleport at will, send the other creatures and denizens of this dream world to attack anyone that he pleases, and even shapeshift the terrain and have full physical control over the world. You'd think with godlike power like this, he would have much higher amount of ability to control what happens in this world. Instead, it seems as if he's leading you to him, as if he's letting you go along for his own benefit. This kind of contradicts what his goals are, and it seems as if he's doing the opposite of what he should be doing if he wants to accomplish his goals. Because, in short, since he's only a brain, he can't leave the system. There's a patient named Leslie who has the perfect mind for being the host of the system. Therefore, Ruvik wants to take over Leslie's body so that he can leave and have physical form again. Now, with this in mind, and to be clear, he doesn't need anyone else's help for this. He just needs to make sure that Leslie's alive, and that no one interrupts him. He doesn't need Sebastian to do this. He doesn't need his partner, he doesn't need his assistant, he doesn't need anyone to do this, and if anything, they would only get in the way or prevent him from doing what he wants. And since pretty much everyone who he encounters either gets brutally tortured when he turns them into monsters or they get killed by said monsters, it seems odd that you'd be able to survive any of these things at all. Especially because of the plethora of guns and ammunition and other things that you can use to fight against these things. It's more a matter of he seems to have intentionally, because it's his world, and I don't think he would overlook this, especially because he constantly confronts you, and then he says, "This is my world, and how dare you?" And he seems to fail very often at killing you, which doesn't really make a ton of sense when he seems to be in control of the whole dream world. But even if that wasn't the case, why would he leave guns everywhere when all it can do is help him to defeat your minions and get through all your traps and to eventually make it to your lair? This is the equivalent of me trying to ensure that nobody gets into my safe by etching in the combination on the front of it. It's complete nonsense. If we put that aside and pretend that it was some sort of intentional thing, it bears no relevance in the end game. Eventually he gets Leslie, who got to Ruvik by his own means. They combine, a giant monster thing shows up, Sebastian kills the giant monster thing, and then he walks out with Leslie's body. There didn't seem to be anything that they could have done to stop him, so him either not doing it sooner in the plot or him not immediately killing them seems contrived, to say the least. And as long as we're talking about the final boss, I am not joking when I say that this is probably, in my opinion, one of the worst final bosses in a survival horror game that I've ever played. Here's what you do in the boss fight for the final boss. Ruvik absorbs Leslie, grows into a giant monster, throws you off of the platform that you're standing on, with unspeakable heights between you and where you land, and somehow you don't break your spine or get any more injured than maybe, say, a couple of bruises. Then he flings you around some more after you run through a little gauntlet in which he tries to grab you but can't. He then hurls you halfway across the large area that you're in, which is never described, but just, ooh, brains and barbed wire, guys. And in the chaos of all of this, while you're falling, you happen to conveniently land inside the truck bed of a military vehicle with a machine gun mounted on it. And lo and behold, Ruvik's monster grabs you while you're in this thing, and then you just shoot at him a bunch. Like, it's completely out of your hands how this goes. It's all basically a cutscene up until this point. So then you shoot at him, and he gets hurt, and he's like, oh, I don't like that. I'm gonna fling you that way. You get impaled through the chest. Also doesn't kill you somehow. And then a soldier, I don't know what kind of soldier it is, but some soldier shows up, and he then happens to hold on to his weapon, which is like a rocket launcher of sorts. So you grab his rocket launcher, and then Ruvik very slowly crawls up to your position, and you hit him in the head with the rocket launcher. And he's all like, oh no, I'm hurt, but not really. You then fall down to where he's about to go, and then he's about to do the final attack and bite down on you. And then using your pistol, you shoot him in the head. And that's not you choose your pistol to shoot him in the head. It just auto-whips your pistol, and it goes into slow motion, and then you shoot him in the head. So what does all of this sound like to you? Does it sound more like Call of Duty or Resident Evil? If you guessed Call of Duty, you've won! Hooray! This was a shitty fucking ending! Because look, the basis of survival horror is using your limited ability to move and your resource management against enemies that require focus, concentration, and tactics. Alright? Now, since any inventory or skills or upgrades you have up to this point are made completely moot by the fact that every weapon that you use is either auto-selected or part of the environment, so you didn't have to collect it anyway, and that everything that you have is completely untense. And I mean that, untense. There is nothing survival horror about a unlimited ammo mounted machine gun. There's nothing survival horror about being given a rocket launcher and being completely held stationary. There is nothing survival horror about the entire game going slow-mo so you can get one final headshot to win the game. I didn't have to rely on any of my skills when I was fighting previous bosses where I'd have to learn to run around at the correct moments, place down traps, conserve my ammo, only use the big stuff for when I absolutely needed it during boss fights, among other things. None of the skills I had previously done mattered. And that's a complete shame. And again, it didn't affect anything because since he already got what he wanted, him fighting me was redundant in the first place. I genuinely don't know why he was fighting me if he got what he wanted anyways. And if he wanted me to kill him, you'd think he would have done something a little bit more on the nose. Something along the lines of making it easier. Because throwing me miles down into a giant pit full of gray matter and barbed wire, and then impaling me and trying to eat me alive does not sound like it went according to plan. Not to mention, there are segments where if you are running away from his hands and he grabs you, he will crush you to death. So it's not like he was avoiding trying to kill you or something. He genuinely wanted you dead. Now, you can compare this to other endings. Now, to be perfectly fair, a thing somewhat similar to this happens in Resident Evil 7. Not to this extent, but somewhat. You start unloading your rounds on the final boss in that game, and then you're given a gun, which is like a special gun, and then you use it on the final boss, and then it's defeated. So your inventory for the most part is just used for the sake of damage output initially, and then after that it doesn't matter because it's just a shooting gallery. So that game doesn't have it perfect either, but we can compare it again to better examples, even in things that I don't consider the best of survival horror, like Dead Space. Even in those games, you still have to keep use of your inventory and your weapons and your skill sets during the final boss. But let's give a moment of fairness. I've been especially hard on Evil Within. You'd think I hate the game, but to be honest, this is a sort of guilty pleasure, in a sense. I don't think the game is good by any stretch of the word. There are good things about it. Even though I describe the level design as extremely inconsistent, the individual levels are relatively well designed and they all look fantastic. The visuals for the time that they came out were pretty good. The aiming is on point. A lot of the actual gameplay elements of using parts from the environment to craft arrows for your agony crossbow, as well as finding ammunition, burning bodies when you want to make sure that they don't get back up. There's a lot of neat things about it. It's the package that these gameplay elements are dressed in that makes it difficult to give this game as a full recommendation. I dig a lot of the plot elements that they wanted to go with, a lot of the build-up in regards to why people do things or how they do things, the backstories for the various characters. They're very interesting. In fact, they're a lot more interesting than the plot that we were given, and I think it'd be better if they went more in-depth with this. Which, to be fair, there's a lot more focus in the DLC. The DLC is one of the better parts of the game as a whole. The Executioner DLC is just fun nonsense where you play as the Keeper. Oh, the Keeper. You're definitely not Pyramid Head. It's like you're definitely not a large guy in a butcher's outfit with some sort of geometric shape in place of your head, with a large, giant piercing or slicing weapon in your hand. You don't have some sort of relentless inability to die as you chase down the protagonist. You're not littered throughout the game. And you definitely don't show up as two of yourselves for a near final encounter before you face the final boss. Nope, it's not him. It's definitely not Pyramid Head. Oh, okay? Okay, Konami's lawyers, we promise, it's not him. The other DLCs concern you playing as Officer Kidman, who is, again, spoiler alert, a secret agent, or a double agent working for an organization called Mobius, who is less susceptible to the crazy brainwaves of the STEM machine, and has to try and go in, extract Leslie, and get out. This DLC gives us a much better look at the narrative and presents better elements of both survival horror and horror. You have a very clear goal right from the get-go. You have a plot which, in addendum to the previous information from the main game's campaign, is given a much better context and is more full, since it is filling in gaps that were in the previous lore and narrative. And the fact that for many parts of the game, you have to hide from your enemies and use very little ammo in comparison to other parts of the game. It definitely pulls off the horror aspect way better than the other segments of the game. Not to mention that the final encounter in this game actually has you using your skills and your weapons against the final boss. Now, we've got a lot of topics that have been covered here, but there's one thing I want to say in regards to design philosophy of a game. Not every game has to be horror all the time or tense all the time. Even in survival horror games, there are moments in which you can have catharsis, which I hear people would say as a defense for the final level, in the sense that you've been trying so hard this whole time, and this game has been ball-crushingly difficult for hours and hours on end, with a ton of seemingly pointless padding just to get to one area. So why not kick back and have something with unlimited ammo where you don't need to think, you can just let go. And that's fair enough. But I want to talk about the idea of the philosophy behind cathartic moments. I'm going to compare two scenes that we have between Resident Evil 4 and Evil Within. There's one moment in Resident Evil 4 in which you finally get some backup. A helicopter comes by, who you have called in for earlier in the game, and it has a full loadout of weapons. It's got missiles, and it's got guns, and it is wonderful. You run through this encampment, and it blows up everything. And it's not a pre-scripted thing in the sense that every single one of them dies before you get there. They're still there, and they can still hurt you if you're too impatient to let the helicopter take care of them before you go in. But it is insanely gratifying for you to run through an area and use very, very little ammo and see all of them get blown to bits after you've been trying hard with the game up to that point. Now, we're going to compare this to a different segment in Evil Within, where you have been running through the game and you're trying to escape onto a bus to get to the center of the city. Because now at this point, there's a plot afoot.
I can't get the thing open.
After you go to another part of a bridge to retrieve an item of sort before going back to the bus, you see that there's an onslaught of enemies surrounding the bus. And so what you need to do is you need to see, oh boy, here's a Gatling gun on the end of a military truck. I'm going to use it. So you use it on all the enemies, and it's also somewhat cathartic and gratifying. But it feels, to me at least, hollow. Because most of these enemies seem to be relatively mindless. There's not a motive behind them. There's not any sort of connectivity between them. I don't see them as, hey, look at all these guys I've been fighting for. Fuck you, I'm going to take you out. Instead, I see it as, here's some enemies I haven't met before, even though they look exactly the same as the previous ones, and now I'm going to shoot them. And I did, and it felt tedious. It felt more like I'm going through a turret segment rather than having an awesome moment of revenge against the enemies in the game. And now we might highlight this. Why does it feel so different? In my opinion, the idea is control. Horror in general works on the basis of limited to little, or even a lack of control over your situation. So in the Resident Evil 4 example, this worked in a matter of catharsis because you were not actually in charge of the helicopter doing all the shooting. You were on the ground and you witnessed the shooting and you could help with it, but you were not actually the one performing it. This meant that you could still witness the very cathartic act of your enemy defeated with little to no effort, but it also meant that you were not necessarily given a seat of power. You were not given a seat of ease. You are still trapped within the control scheme that you've always had. Now, compare that to Evil Within, where when I was at the Gatling gun, I never once felt threatened by these people. I never once felt threatened by the enemies trying to get into the bus. Now, they do run at you for a bit, and it's not completely impossible to lose, but even on relatively harder difficulties, this part is a cakewalk. And hearing this part is a cakewalk is not something that you should encourage people to hear when you're talking about survival horror. With all these factors in mind, I'm going to give a closing word. The gameplay can be satisfying at times when you play it on lower difficulties. This isn't to say that you should be discouraged from playing on higher difficulties. It's just that the amount of health sponge type scenarios that happen in this game is so ridiculously high that you'd be better off with a lesser challenge but with less annoyance as well than a better challenge but with much less fair tactic. I would recommend that people play this if they find it on discount, maybe if they get it with a bundle of other games, because there are fun moments in this game. There are a lot of interesting things about this game that can be presented, such as certain elements of the backstory of the villain and the art design. Because I'll tell you what, I love the look and feel of this game when it comes to enemy design and level layout. The way that all of them look like they're cover art for a Saw film gives a really unique and grungy aesthetic that I dig. I really dig it. But a game is not necessarily made up of what you dig about the character design. A game is not necessarily made out of a few moments. You have to take it as a whole. And as a whole, this game is difficult in a way that is frustrating more than tense or gratifying, and it is incohesive in a way that is more redundant and confusing than it is merely mysterious or enigmatic. If I had to give this game a rating, I would honestly give it, on a good day, I'd probably give it a 6. Today, I'm probably going to give it a 4. You'll still have fun with the action in this game, but taken as a whole, there are too many things that are flawed and inconsistent with its presentation for me to recommend it higher than that. But do bear in mind, people outside of me have been very, very open about their criticism of this game. If we have any luck, then the sequel, which comes out today, should have addressed some of these issues and might be the game that we wanted the first time around. I can't say for sure. I haven't played it yet, because as of the time of me recording this, it's not out, but it will be out by the time that it is rendered and uploaded to YouTube. So keep this in mind. If the developers were listening, we should have a significantly better product. Something that we can actually sink our teeth into without ripping our controllers in half. And I will be playing it, and hopefully you can hear my full thoughts on it maybe in a month or so if I decide to do a full review on it. If not, I can at the very least give you a impressions video after I've played a significant portion of it. But with all of that out of the way, I'd like to thank you very much for watching this video and taking the time to hear out my criticisms of the game. I apologize if I came off harshly. I don't hate this game, but if I want people to improve in their craft and understand certain parts of a genre that they appreciate, it is better to be earnest than to pull your punches. And I hope to see you all for the next set of videos.